$20,000. That's what he thought his 63-year-old grandmother was worth when he sold her to human traffickers. Not for drugs, not for gambling debts, not even for pure greed. No. This grandson's motive was something far more twisted. Revenge for what she had done to him over 16 years of living under her roof. The transaction took place in an abandoned warehouse, cold and calculated, like any other business deal. But this wasn't just any victim. This was family, this was blood. What could an elderly woman possibly do to her own grandson to deserve such brutal payback? You are about to find out. Welcome to True Crime Journal HQ. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily update on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe. To understand how a family bond could shatter so completely, we need to go back to where it all began. Dorothy Ashworth wasn't born evil. She was molded by circumstances that would eventually turn her into a master manipulator. Born in 1960 in the quiet suburb of Millbrook Heights, Dorothy grew up in a household where control meant survival. Her father was a strict military man who demanded absolute obedience, and her mother was a woman who learned to smile through tears. Dorothy absorbed these lessons early. Power came from controlling others, and weakness was something to be exploited, not comforted. By the time she reached adulthood, Dorothy had perfected her public persona. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for church functions, volunteered at the local library, and always remembered birthdays. Neighbors saw her as the community's backbone, reliable, generous, and selfless. She had married young, raised 2 children, and after her husband's death from cancer in 2010, she maintained her reputation as the widow who handled everything with grace. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect on the outside? Someone whose public image was so polished it almost felt too good to be true. Dorothy was exactly that person. Behind closed doors, however, she was methodical in her need to control every detail of life around her. Her own children learned early to tread carefully around their mother's expectations, and both moved across the country the moment they turned 18. Meanwhile, Calvin Winters was living a completely different childhood. Born to loving parents, David and Lisa Winters, Calvin's early years were filled with weekend camping trips, bedtime stories, and the kind of unconditional love that builds strong, confident children. His parents weren't wealthy, but they were devoted. They had established a trust fund for Calvin's education, putting away money each month to ensure their son would have opportunities they never had. Calvin was 12 when everything changed in a single devastating night. A drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening, killing both of his parents instantly. In one moment, Calvin went from being a protected, cherished child to an orphan with nowhere to go. How would you have coped losing your parents at 12? Can you even comprehend that level of loss at such a young age? This is where Dorothy entered Calvin's story. She was a distant relative, his father's second cousin, but she was the only family member willing to take in a grieving child. The community rallied around what they saw as Dorothy's incredible generosity. Here was a widow in her 50s, taking in a traumatized boy out of pure kindness. Dorothy is an angel, people would say. That poor boy is so lucky to have her. Calvin arrived at Dorothy's house with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. Dorothy welcomed him with open arms, tears in her eyes, promising him a new home and a fresh start. The neighbors watched approvingly as she enrolled him in school, bought him new clothes, and made sure he had everything he needed. Have you ever been grateful for help that came with hidden strings? Because what Calvin couldn't see, what no one could see, was that Dorothy's kindness came with a price. Within weeks of Calvin's arrival, the subtle changes began. Dorothy would make comments about how expensive it was to feed a growing boy, how much his school supplies cost, and how she was sacrificing her retirement savings for his sake. She never said it angrily, always with a martyred sigh, as if she was just sharing the burden with him. "I don't mind, sweetie," she would say, "but you understand how much I'm giving up for you, don't you?" Calvin, desperate for stability and terrified of losing another family figure, absorbed every guilt-laden comment. He began apologizing for needing things, for eating too much, for simply existing in Dorothy's space. She would respond with hugs and reassurances, but the message was clear. He was a burden, and he owed her everything. Dorothy had discovered something powerful. A child's desperate need for approval could be weaponized into complete control. She began monitoring Calvin's friendships, questioning his activities, and slowly isolating him from anyone who might give him a different perspective on their relationship. When teachers complimented Calvin's intelligence, Dorothy would smile and nod, then privately tell Calvin that he shouldn't get too proud because pride comes before a fall. The community continued to see Dorothy as a saint, raising a troubled child. When Calvin seemed withdrawn or anxious, they attributed it to his trauma, never suspecting that his guardian was the source of his distress. But Dorothy's version of care was about to become Calvin's living nightmare. Most people never see the mask until it's too late. Subscribe now to learn the signs before you find yourself trapped like Calvin, and if you'd rather take that risk, type your reason in the comments. We'll all be curious to read it. What happened next wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Dorothy didn't suddenly transform into a monster. Instead, she slowly tightened her grip on Calvin's life, one seemingly reasonable restriction at a time. By Calvin's 13th birthday, Dorothy had established a routine of psychological conditioning that would continue for 16 years. She controlled his schedule down to the minute. Homework time, mealtime, chores, bedtime, everything happened according to her rules. When Calvin asked to join the school soccer team, Dorothy explained that sports were too expensive and too dangerous for someone in his situation. "Remember, Calvin," she would say, stroking his hair, "everything costs money, and money doesn't grow on trees. You wouldn't want to be more of a burden than you already are, would you?" Calvin learned to stop asking for things. Birthday parties, school trips, even staying after school to work on projects. Dorothy found reasons why each request was unreasonable, selfish, or financially impossible. She never said no outright. She was more clever than that. Instead, she would sigh deeply, look at her checkbook, and explain how tight money was since she had taken him in. The isolation was gradual but complete. When Calvin made friends at school, Dorothy would find fault with them. Tommy was a bad influence, Maria came from the wrong kind of family, and Jason was clearly trouble waiting to happen. She convinced Calvin that other people couldn't be trusted, that they would only disappoint him like his parents had, by leaving. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation you couldn't escape, where every door you tried to open was quietly locked by someone who claimed to love you? Dorothy's control extended to Calvin's education, but not in the way anyone would expect. While she publicly supported his academic achievements, privately she undermined his confidence. When Calvin brought home an A on a test, Dorothy would study it carefully and point out the one question he had gotten wrong. "Good job, sweetie," she would say. "But you see here, this mistake shows you're getting careless. Pride makes people sloppy, and sloppy people fail in the real world." She enrolled Calvin in community college instead of a 4-year university, explaining that it was more practical and less expensive. What Calvin didn't know was that his parents' trust fund could have easily covered tuition at any school in the state. Dorothy had been receiving statements for that account since Calvin turned 18, but she intercepted every piece of mail related to his finances. By his early 20s, Calvin had internalized Dorothy's voice so completely that he sabotaged himself before she needed to. He turned down job opportunities because they seemed too good to be true. He avoided romantic relationships because Dorothy had convinced him he was damaged goods who would only hurt people he cared about. "You're lucky to have me," Dorothy would remind him during their nightly conversations. "I'm the only one who understands your problems, who sees past your issues. Other people would give up on you." Calvin's attempts at independence were met with increasingly sophisticated manipulation. When he saved money for an apartment at age 24, Dorothy suddenly developed chest pains that required expensive medical tests. The money Calvin had saved went to doctors who found nothing wrong. When he applied for a better job at 26, Dorothy had a fall that left her needing constant care, care that only Calvin could provide. What would you do if someone controlled every aspect of your life through guilt, fear, and emotional blackmail? The financial manipulation was Dorothy's masterpiece. She handled all of Calvin's paperwork, from tax returns to bank accounts. She convinced him that managing money was too stressful for someone with his emotional challenges. Calvin received a weekly allowance from his own paycheck, while Dorothy managed the rest for his own good. Every month, Dorothy would sit Calvin down for what she called their financial reality check. She would show him fake bills, inflated expenses, and fabricated costs associated with his care. According to Dorothy's carefully constructed lies, Calvin owed her over $50,000 for his upbringing, food, housing, and medical expenses. "I'm not asking you to pay me back," Dorothy would say, "because I love you. But you need to understand what your presence has cost me, what I've sacrificed." Calvin worked 2 jobs but never seemed to get ahead. Dorothy explained that this was normal, that most people his age struggled with money. She never mentioned the trust fund growing in an account with his name on it. She never told him about the life insurance policies his parents had left him. She never revealed the inheritance that rightfully belonged to him. By his 27th birthday, Calvin had become exactly what Dorothy wanted: a broken, dependent adult who believed he owed her everything and deserved nothing. He had no friends, no romantic relationships, and no hope for a future beyond serving Dorothy's needs. But Calvin was about to turn 28, and with that birthday would come legal access to certain documents that Dorothy had kept hidden for 16 years. Little did Calvin know, Dorothy's betrayal went deeper than he could ever imagine. Every minute you're not subscribed is another minute you might miss a warning sign in your own life. Don't be the person who says, "I wish I knew sooner." Hit subscribe, and if you won't, tell us why you'd choose silence instead. March 12th, 2023. Calvin's 28th birthday arrived like any other day in Dorothy's controlled household. She had baked his favorite cake, wrapped a modest gift, and prepared her usual speech about another year of growth and gratitude. But this birthday was different in a way Dorothy had never anticipated. Under federal law, Calvin now had legal access to certain financial documents that had been sealed since his parents' death. Information that Dorothy had spent 16 years keeping buried was about to surface. The letter arrived 3 days later, a thick envelope from Millbrook Trust Estate Services. Dorothy intercepted it, as she had done with all of Calvin's mail for years, but this time Calvin was waiting. He had called the company directly and requested duplicate copies be sent to his workplace. Calvin opened the envelope in his car during lunch break, expecting routine paperwork about old accounts that had probably been closed years ago. Instead, he found statements showing active accounts with his name on them, accounts with balances that made his hands shake. The trust fund his parents had established contained $127,000. There was also a life insurance payout of $53,000 that had been earning interest for 16 years. Combined with investment growth, Calvin was looking at nearly $180,000 that belonged to him, money that Dorothy had been managing and, according to the statements, systematically withdrawing from for over a decade. How would you react to discovering such a massive betrayal, that the person you trusted most had been stealing your future, dollar by dollar, for 16 years? Calvin sat in his car, reading the same numbers over and over. Every lie Dorothy had told him about money being tight, every guilt trip about being a burden, every sacrifice she claimed to be making. It was all built on theft. She had been living comfortably off his inheritance while convincing him he owed her everything. That evening, Calvin confronted Dorothy with the statements. He expected tears, apologies, maybe explanations about emergencies or misunderstandings. Instead, Dorothy's reaction revealed the cold calculation that had always existed beneath her nurturing mask. "You think you deserve that money?" Dorothy asked, not even attempting to deny the theft. "After everything I've sacrificed for you?" "That money paid for keeping you alive, Calvin. It paid for your food, your clothes, your roof. You should be grateful there's anything left." Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost bored. She had prepared for this conversation, and her response was designed to make Calvin feel guilty for even questioning her actions. But something fundamental shifted in Calvin's mind during that conversation. For the first time in 16 years, he saw Dorothy clearly, not as his savior but as his captor. Not as someone who loved him, but as someone who had been systematically destroying him while profiting from his pain. Is there a point where someone can be pushed too far? Where years of psychological conditioning suddenly snap, leaving something completely different in its place. Calvin's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was thorough. Over the following weeks, he began documenting everything. He secretly recorded Dorothy's daily manipulations, her casual cruelty, her reminders about what he owed her. He photographed financial documents, saved voicemails, and created a comprehensive record of 16 years of emotional abuse. But documentation wasn't enough. Calvin had moved beyond seeking justice through conventional means. The legal system might recover some of his money, but it couldn't restore 16 years of his life. It couldn't repair the relationships Dorothy had sabotaged, the opportunities she had stolen, or the self-worth she had systematically destroyed. Calvin began researching alternative forms of justice. His internet searches grew darker, more specific. He learned about people who disappeared, about networks that operated outside the law, about transactions that happened in shadows where traditional justice couldn't reach. Could someone you know be capable of such planning? Could years of abuse transform a broken, dependent person into someone calculating enough to research human trafficking networks? Calvin created encrypted email accounts, downloaded secure browsers, and began navigating parts of the internet most people never see. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was methodical. Every search, every contact, every plan was designed with one goal: making Dorothy understand what it felt like to be helpless, controlled, and betrayed. Dorothy had no idea that the broken boy she had spent 16 years creating was about to become her worst nightmare. She continued her daily routine of manipulation and control, never noticing that Calvin had stopped responding to her guilt trips, stopped apologizing for existing, and started watching her with calculating, patient eyes. What Calvin was planning would shock even seasoned investigators. If betrayal can destroy someone this completely, ask yourself, could you be next? Subscribe now before you learn the truth the hard way. And if you're not going to, put your reason in the comments. We'll all be wondering. Calvin's transformation from victim to predator took exactly 6 weeks. During those 42 days, he maintained his normal routine, working his 2 jobs, coming home to Dorothy's criticisms, enduring her nightly lectures about gratitude and debt. But behind the mask of compliance, Calvin was researching possibilities that most people couldn't comprehend. His first step was learning about the dark web's hidden marketplaces. Calvin discovered forums where people discussed things that would horrify ordinary citizens. He read testimonials from buyers and sellers, studied pricing structures, and learned the vocabulary of a world that operated entirely outside legal boundaries. The trafficking networks weren't difficult to find once Calvin knew where to look. What surprised him was how businesslike these operations were. They had customer service representatives, dispute resolution processes, and detailed catalogs organized by age, gender, and intended use. Calvin spent hours reading about merchandise management and client satisfaction protocols. He learned that elderly targets were considered less valuable than younger ones, but they were also easier to transport and control. The going rate for a healthy woman Dorothy's age was typically between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on intended purpose and delivery conditions. What warning signs might we have missed? How do you detect when someone is crossing the line from fantasy to planning? Calvin began making contact with potential buyers. His communications were carefully crafted, professional, and completely devoid of emotion. He described Dorothy's physical condition, her mental state, and her complete lack of family or friends who would notice her absence. He negotiated delivery terms, payment methods, and guarantees about her condition upon transfer. The network representative who ultimately agreed to the transaction was impressed by Calvin's thoroughness. Calvin had provided detailed photographs, medical history, and even personality assessments that would help buyers determine Dorothy's suitability for their operation. The agreed-upon price was $20,000 in cryptocurrency, paid in advance to an encrypted wallet Calvin had established. But money wasn't Calvin's primary motivation. He wanted Dorothy to experience the same helplessness he had felt for 16 years. He wanted her to understand what it meant to have someone else control every aspect of her existence, to wake up each day knowing she was completely powerless and dependent on the whims of people who saw her as nothing more than property. How does someone justify such an unthinkable act? Calvin's justification was elegantly simple. Dorothy had stolen 16 years of his life, so he would arrange for her to spend whatever remained of hers in circumstances that matched what she had put him through. Calvin planned the logistics with the same methodical precision Dorothy had used to control his life. He researched isolated locations, studied traffic patterns, and identified the abandoned warehouse that would serve as the transfer point. He practiced the route multiple times, timing each segment and identifying potential complications. The psychological preparation required Calvin to completely disconnect from any remaining emotional attachment to Dorothy. He began referring to her in his mind as the target or the merchandise. He practiced conversations where he would need to deceive her, rehearsing facial expressions and vocal tones that would maintain her trust until the moment of betrayal. Calvin's plan included a carefully constructed cover story about wanting to reconcile their relationship. He would tell Dorothy he had been thinking about their confrontation over the money, that he understood her perspective, and that he wanted to take her somewhere special, where they could talk without distractions. He knew Dorothy's ego would make her believe she had successfully manipulated him back into submission. The fake reconciliation trip would begin at 2 p.m. on March 15th. Calvin had told Dorothy they were visiting a scenic mountain cabin where his parents used to take him, a place with emotional significance that would make her believe his intentions were genuine. Instead, he would drive her to coordinates provided by the trafficking network, where representatives would be waiting with $20,000 and transportation to Dorothy's new life. Calvin's emotional detachment was complete by early March. He felt no anxiety, no guilt, and no second thoughts. He had become exactly what Dorothy's abuse had created, someone capable of calculating cruelty without emotional interference. Dorothy had no idea that her life as a free person would end in exactly 9 days. March 15th would become a date that changed both their lives forever. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. The people you think you know could already be making plans you can't imagine. Subscribe now to stay aware, or tell us in the comments why you'd rather stay vulnerable. March 15th, 2023. 1:47 p.m. Calvin knocked softly on Dorothy's bedroom door, his voice carefully modulated to sound hopeful and vulnerable, exactly the tone she expected from him. "Dorothy, I've been thinking about what you said, about the money, about everything. You're right, I was ungrateful." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want to make it up to you. There's somewhere special I'd like to take you, somewhere we can talk properly." Dorothy's response was immediate and predictable. She opened the door with that familiar smile, the one that had fooled an entire community for 16 years. In her mind, Calvin had crawled back, broken and repentant, just as she had trained him to do. "Oh, sweetie," she said, reaching out to touch his face. "I knew you'd come to your senses. You're a good boy, Calvin, you just get confused sometimes." Calvin forced himself to lean into her touch, suppressing every instinct that screamed at him to pull away. "I thought we could visit that cabin where my parents used to take me. The one I told you about. I want to share that memory with you. Show you how much you mean to me." Dorothy's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of gesture she had trained him to make, putting her at the center of his most precious memories. "That sounds beautiful, Calvin. When do we leave?" "Right now, if you're ready. It's about an hour's drive, and I want us to have time to really talk." 20 minutes later, they were in Calvin's car, Dorothy chatting excitedly about their healing conversation, while Calvin followed GPS coordinates that led nowhere near any mountain cabin. The first 30 minutes of the drive felt normal to Dorothy. Calvin seemed attentive, asking her opinion about things, letting her control the conversation the way she always had. But somewhere around the 40-minute mark, Dorothy began to notice changes. Calvin had stopped responding to her comments. His hands gripped the steering wheel with unusual tension. They were driving through industrial areas she didn't recognize, past abandoned buildings and empty lots. "Calvin," Dorothy's voice carried the first note of uncertainty. "Are you sure this is the right way? This doesn't look like the route to any cabin." Calvin didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Calvin, I'm talking to you. Where exactly are we going?" Still nothing. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. Fear. Real, helpless fear. The car turned into an industrial complex, past a rusted sign for a demolition company that had clearly been closed for years. Dorothy saw the abandoned warehouse ahead, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and two vehicles parked outside with their engines running. "Calvin, stop the car right now." Dorothy's voice rose to a pitch Calvin had never heard before. "What is this? What's happening?" Calvin parked exactly where his contact had instructed, 20 feet from the warehouse entrance. He turned off the engine and sat silently for a moment, staring at his hands. 3 men emerged from the building. They moved with professional efficiency, checking the surroundings before approaching the car. One of them tapped on Calvin's window. "Calvin, please." Dorothy's voice cracked. For the first time in 16 years, she was begging him for something. "Whatever this is, we can talk about it. I love you, you know I love you." Calvin stepped out of the car and walked to Dorothy's side. When he opened her door, she pressed herself back against the seat, her eyes wide with terror. Can you imagine the terror Dorothy felt in that moment? The complete helplessness of realizing that the person she had controlled for 16 years now held absolute power over her fate. "Get out," Calvin said quietly. No, I'm not getting out." "Calvin, what did I do? What did I do that was so wrong?" Calvin's expression didn't change. "Everything." The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Dorothy was transferred to the buyers like any other piece of merchandise, her pleas and promises echoing off the warehouse walls. Calvin watched without emotion as they secured her in their vehicle, his face as blank as Dorothy's had been during 16 years of systematically destroying his life. The lead buyer counted out $20,000 in cash, placing it in Calvin's hands. "Pleasure doing business," he said with professional courtesy. As their vehicle drove away, Dorothy's muffled screams fading into the distance, Calvin stood alone in the abandoned parking lot. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no sense of completion, just emptiness where emotions used to be. How does someone cross such an unthinkable line? The same way Dorothy had crossed hers, Calvin realized, one small compromise at a time, until the unthinkable became inevitable. Calvin drove home to Dorothy's empty house and began the performance that would define the next 3 weeks of his life. He would play the concerned grandson, the worried family member, the desperate man searching for his missing guardian. But this was just the beginning of Dorothy's nightmare. If you think you'd see this kind of betrayal coming, think again. Subscribe now to protect yourself from the truths you'd rather not face, or share in the comments why you think it could never happen to you. March 16th, 6:23 a.m. Calvin called 911 from Dorothy's kitchen, his voice perfectly calibrated to convey panic and desperation. "Please, I need help. My grandmother is missing. She didn't come home last night, and this isn't like her. She never goes anywhere without telling me." The responding officer found Calvin exactly where he needed to be, pacing Dorothy's living room, disheveled and frantic, surrounded by evidence of his concern. He had called Dorothy's few acquaintances, contacted local hospitals, and even printed missing person flyers with Dorothy's photo and his phone number. Detective Maria Santos arrived 2 hours later. A 20-year veteran with sharp instincts, she began her standard missing person protocol, while Calvin provided his carefully rehearsed timeline. "She seemed upset yesterday," Calvin explained, wiping his eyes with tissues. "We had a disagreement about money. Nothing serious, just normal family stuff. She said she needed some air, that she was going for a drive to clear her head. That was around 2 p.m. When she wasn't back by dinner, I got worried." Have you ever been completely fooled by someone's act? Detective Santos initially saw exactly what Calvin wanted her to see. A devoted grandson desperate to find his missing guardian. Calvin's performance over the following days was masterful. He organized search parties, appeared on local news broadcasts, and created social media campaigns with hashtags like "Find Dorothy" and "Sharks Bring Her Home." The community responded exactly as he had predicted. "Calvin is such a good boy," neighbors told reporters. "Dorothy raised him right after his parents died. He's been taking care of her for years. Local news stations ran human interest pieces about the devoted grandson refusing to give up hope. Calvin gave interviews from Dorothy's front porch, always with the right amount of exhaustion and determination in his voice. "She's all the family I have left," he told Channel 7 News. "I can't imagine life without her guidance and love. If someone out there has seen her, please call the tip line." Meanwhile, Dorothy's nightmare was unfolding in a basement 200 miles away. The buyers had transferred her to what they called a processing facility, a nondescript house in a rural area where newly acquired assets were broken down and prepared for their final destinations. Dorothy was confined in a windowless room, chained to a bed, with minimal food and water. Could you survive what Dorothy went through? The physical conditions were deliberately harsh, but the psychological torture was worse. Dorothy was forced to listen as her captors discussed her sale value and debated which buyer would be most interested in her specifications. For the first week, Dorothy screamed, pleaded, and demanded to be released. She offered money, promised silence, and threatened legal consequences. Her captors ignored her completely, treating her objections as background noise. By the second week, Dorothy's resistance had crumbled into desperate bargaining. She began sharing information about Calvin, thinking somehow this would help her situation. She told them about the inheritance money, about their family dynamics, about anything she thought might be useful. "The boy owes me everything," she whispered to anyone who would listen. "I saved him. I raised him. He would never do this to me." But Dorothy's certainty began to crack as she replayed the events leading to her capture. Calvin's strange behavior during the drive, his refusal to answer her questions, the calculated way he had walked away from the warehouse without looking back. Meanwhile, Detective Santos was beginning to notice inconsistencies in Calvin's story, small details that didn't align, timestamps that seemed rehearsed, and an emotional response that felt slightly off-key. What red flags might investigators have noticed? Santos observed that Calvin's grief seemed performed rather than genuine. His timeline was too precise, his explanations too polished, and his media appearances too comfortable for someone genuinely distraught. The breakthrough came during week 3, when the digital forensics team completed their analysis of Calvin's electronic devices. Hidden beneath layers of encryption and deleted files, they discovered Calvin's research into trafficking networks, his communications with buyers, and detailed plans for Dorothy's transfer. "We need to talk," Santos told Calvin as she arrived at Dorothy's house with backup officers and arrest warrants. Calvin's mask finally slipped. Faced with undeniable evidence, his concerned grandson act crumbled into cold indifference. "You found her?" he asked with genuine curiosity, as if inquiring about a lost package rather than a human being. The rescue operation launched immediately. Using Calvin's communication logs, federal agents traced the trafficking network to the rural processing house where Dorothy had spent 21 days in captivity. When agents breached the basement door, they found Dorothy physically weakened but psychologically shattered. She cowered in the corner, initially refusing to believe that rescue was real. Her first coherent words were apologies, still programmed after 3 weeks of torture to blame herself for whatever was happening to her. The medical team that examined Dorothy documented extensive psychological trauma beyond her physical condition. She alternated between periods of catatonic silence and frantic confessions about every mistake she believed she had made in raising Calvin. "I should have been kinder," she told the crisis counselor. "I should have given him more. This is my fault. I made him angry." Even after everything Dorothy had endured, even after discovering the depth of Calvin's planning and betrayal, she was still trying to take responsibility for his choices. April 8th, 2023. Calvin Winters was formally charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, human trafficking, and elder abuse. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Encrypted communications, financial transactions, detailed planning documents, and his own recorded confessions during interrogation. But the most disturbing discovery came from Calvin's personal files. Investigators found 16 years of meticulous documentation detailing Dorothy's psychological manipulation tactics, audio recordings of her guilt trips, photographs of financial documents showing the stolen inheritance, and detailed journals chronicling every instance of emotional abuse he had endured. The prosecution faced an unprecedented legal challenge. How do you argue for maximum sentencing when the defendant had clearly been a victim of systematic abuse for most of his adult life? How do you balance justice for Dorothy's ordeal against the documented evidence of her own crimes? Calvin's defense attorney presented a compelling case about prolonged psychological abuse, financial theft, and the devastating effects of trauma on decision-making. Mental health experts testified about the long-term impact of controlling relationships and how victims can develop distorted thinking patterns that normalize extreme behavior. Yet Calvin himself showed no interest in these justifications. During his sentencing hearing, he displayed the same cold detachment he had shown throughout the investigation. "I regret nothing," Calvin told the court. "Dorothy Ashworth stole 16 years of my life, my inheritance, and my future. 3 weeks of discomfort doesn't begin to balance that equation." The judge sentenced Calvin to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The courtroom was divided. Some saw justice served, others saw another victim of Dorothy's manipulation, finally paying the ultimate price. Dorothy's recovery proved more complex than anyone anticipated. The physical trauma from her captivity healed within months, but the psychological damage ran deeper. She suffered from severe anxiety, nightmares, and an overwhelming fear of being alone. The woman who had controlled every aspect of Calvin's life now couldn't function without constant supervision. Most surprisingly, Dorothy never acknowledged her role in creating the situation. Even after extensive therapy, she maintained that she had been a loving guardian who had sacrificed everything for Calvin's welfare. When shown evidence of the stolen inheritance and recorded examples of her manipulation, Dorothy's response remained consistent. "I was protecting him from himself." Dorothy filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for her ordeal, but the case became complicated when Calvin's inheritance theft was fully documented. The court ultimately awarded her a settlement that barely covered her medical expenses, while the remainder of Calvin's original inheritance was placed in a victims' fund for trafficking survivors. The Millbrook Heights community remains deeply divided about the case. Some residents still view Dorothy as the victim of an ungrateful grandson's revenge. Others recognize her as a skilled manipulator who created her own nemesis through years of systematic abuse. Who was the real victim in this story? The question has no simple answer. Dorothy was undeniably the victim of a horrific crime that no one deserves to experience. But Calvin was also the victim of 16 years of psychological and financial abuse that shaped him into someone capable of unthinkable revenge. Can abuse ever justify such extreme revenge? The legal system answered definitively, no. But the moral question continues to generate heated debate in online forums, therapy sessions, and academic discussions about the cycles of abuse. Today, Calvin serves his sentence at a federal facility in Pennsylvania. He spends his time reading, writing letters he never sends, and maintaining his position that his actions were justified. Prison counselors report that he shows no signs of remorse or desire for rehabilitation. Dorothy lives in an assisted living facility under her real name, which we cannot reveal for her safety. She requires daily medication for anxiety and depression, but has slowly begun participating in support groups for trafficking survivors. She still maintains that Calvin's actions were unprovoked and inexplicable. What signs of family manipulation should we watch for? Financial control, isolation from friends, constant guilt trips about being a burden, and systematic undermining of self-confidence are all warning signs that a relationship has moved beyond normal family dynamics into abuse territory. The case of Calvin Winters and Dorothy Ashworth forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family relationships, the long-term effects of psychological abuse, and the dangerous potential for victims to become perpetrators when pushed beyond their breaking point. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. Have you ever experienced toxic family dynamics that left you questioning your own perceptions of reality? What would you have done in Calvin's situation when you discovered 16 years of systematic theft and manipulation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. You've just seen how abuse, manipulation, and revenge can destroy everything. If you're still not subscribed, ask yourself why, and tell us in the comments. Because the next story might hit closer to home than you think.